Hello, everybody. Good afternoon for those who join us in Hong Kong, and good morning for those who join us in Europe. Today, we are very happy to have Professor Ruth Oldenziel to give a talk on urban mobility for us, cycling. So let me introduce, I'm Angela Leung. I'm the director of the Hong Kong Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences. And I will introduce Professor Oldenziel, and then I will ask my colleague Izumi Nakayama to handle the Q&A session after the talk. Right. So Professor Ruth Oldenziel is professor in the history of technology in Eindhoven, Eindhoven University of Technology. I don't know whether I pronounced the name correctly. In the Netherlands. Her areas of expertise include history of science and technology, the history of American-European relations, consumer goods, gender studies, and the history of sustainable mobility, which is the topic of her talk today. She has a very long list of publications. I don't have the time to read them out today. And she's also currently the editor-in-chief of the leading journal of history, the leading journal in the field, Technology and Culture, published by Johns Hopkins University. Ruth is Dutch, but she was also educated in America, where she obtained a PhD in American history at Yale University, which explains her well-known expertise in American-European relations. She's the program leader of a project called Cycling Cities, the Global Experience, which is a research project, I believe, hosted by her university, with the collaboration with the Foundation for the History of Technology that has received attention from, the project has received attention from policymakers and researchers alike. And she has been publishing on the topic for more than 10 years. If you check her list of publication, you will realize that. And Ruth's work was known to our project, Making Modernity in East Asia, known to our project members at the very beginning of our collaboration in 2015. We were very much inspired by the series of books called Making Europe, which was produced by the Tensions of Europe network that looks at the making of modern Europe through the lens of technology, the way that we try to do for East Asia. That network, that European network, was born in 1999 at precisely the Eindhoven University where Ruth teaches. One of the most inspiring books in the book series was Ruth's volume called Cold War Kitchen, Americanization, Technology and European Users, published in 2009. The book looks at how the technology of everyday consumption shapes modern Europe. Fascinating book. The Tensions of Europe network still holds regular international conferences in Europe. Our team met with some members of the European network in Singapore at the annual Congress of the Society for the History of Technology back in 2016. And again, we met the team, the Tensions of Europe team, including Ruth, who received us in Luxembourg back in 2019, in June, I believe. We presented our project to our European colleagues at that occasion. We greatly enjoyed our short stay in Luxembourg and the productive intellectual exchange with our European colleagues. And that happened shortly before the world was closed down by COVID. Actually, we would very much like to meet Ruth in face-to-face. If we could invite her to Hong Kong, it would be wonderful. But given the current COVID situation, we are very grateful that she has accepted to present her work to us via Zoom. And today she will talk on her current project, and the title of her talk is U-Turn to the Future, Sustainable Urban Mobility Since 1850. After her talk, She will answer questions. We have about half an hour of Q&A or a little bit more if time allows. Please put your questions in the box Q&A during the talk and afterwards, and Ruth will try to answer the questions for you. So I will give the time to Ruth now, and we will mute ourselves and we'll disappear from the screen, and so that Ruth can share her PowerPoint with everyone. Ruth, it's yours.
Well, first of all, I'm truly honored to be invited. Such an eminent group. It's quite frustrating that I cannot really see you, but from the short introduction that Angela gave, it shows the many things that we have in common. I want to explain a little bit where I am intellectually. I was trained as an historian, very much a humanities scholar, and through my dissertation became interested in the history of technology. And I have to be very honest with you that technology was something that was quite intimidating to me. And I guess that is sort of my intellectual curiosity always brings me in places of discomfort. A history of technology as a definition, I think is closest to what anthropologists would call material culture. And my work has been very much a kind of bottom-up history, first inspired by gender studies, feminist studies, how one can use sources by reading against the grain. So that has methodologically and intellectually and theoretically, that has inspired my early work. And I carried that with me when I entered the very strange world of engineering schools, where I have been since 2003. And I started as the only woman there, and was very fortunate to find a dynamic group of men in an engineering school, the History of Technology group at Eindhoven, and I was part of the group that started in 1999, the Tensions of Europe network, and it tried to come up with a narrative of history where we looked at political history through the lens of technology. The idea was that a lot of the stories that we have are political stories of struggles of nations against each other, and never looking at people in the middle, the engineers that are building bridges, digging canals that go across borders. And so it was very much a kind of idea to go beyond the political history, beyond economic history, and to look through that lens. And within that group, I, with a couple of other people, then looked at bottom-up history, what happened when you follow people rather than the engineers, the people who use technology. And that is where the Cold War Kitchen was one book. The other book was what we call Users, Rebels, that I did with Michael Hart. And in the course of that research, I came upon the history of cycling. Now, as a Dutch person, but I also know this because I did visit Hong Kong, and I did visit China. Cycling is something that we do every day. And so it happened just by coincidence that I encountered the topic of cycling, and it has been a fantastic topic for two reasons. One, as I stated, it's a ordinary, everyday object, and for that reason, it's interesting as for social practices to understand the formation of class, formation of the interaction of technology and the people who are using it. But as consequently, I have also started to use it to understand about what history means. This is a long introduction to the lecture I'm going to give you, but I wanted to give you a sense of where I'm coming from. Since I cannot see you and I do not know where you're coming from, I thought that this might be helpful to bridge the intellectual currents that are collected in this room, the collective wisdom of us all. Since 2003, I have been in engineering schools, and humanities always have basically are not really addressed. And so you will see from what I'm presenting is that I have been thinking about what is now called environmental humanities. Now, what can humanities contribute to environmental history? So that is some of my thinking. You will see reflected here. What is the place of for historians or humanities scholars in the study of technology, and then we call that, in a larger sense, innovation studies. Okay, with that, I'm going to now present the lecture, and to do so, I need to pull up my, let me see, this is always a point of anxiety. Will this work? Let me see, I'm going to share my screen. And I think that it should be visible now. I have to do one more thing. Yeah. Can anyone flag me if that's okay? Can you see the PowerPoint? I guess I can. Okay. Okay, so the title is U-Turns to the Future. If there's one thing that historians are good at is to think about periodization, about change. And there is a study, a particular branch of scholarship in innovation studies, and that's called transition studies. It's the idea that in order to create change, to have a better future, we need to transition towards the future. And there's a lot of talk about energy transition and mobility transition, and a lot of policymakers are interested in change. You see here on the screen a picture of it's the cover of the latest book that I did with a group of people. We edited this, and it's about the uses of history as a kind of a usable past. You know, how can history be useful for our current debates about climate change? And we take a long-term perspective, 1850s, that would be kind of the period of globalization and colonialization. The argument is that history does have a place to play. The image here is a famous image from 1987, where protesters were trying to make an intervention to say that the car-dominated street is a very wasteful way of using urban space. And this image has been reenacted as a political act in many cities since then. I know how this was made. You see on the top left, you see a lot of the same cars, de chevaux, and that was because they asked a association of de chevaux to participate in this. In any case, so let me see if I can get to the next picture. So I'm interested as an historian of technology in the stories of innovations, and this is very much how. Let's see if I can change this. I don't know if this is okay. So the talk in policy circles about changing for the better is always about the future. It's always about the future that is before us. And I have a little bit trouble with, yeah. So the question becomes, why should historians be part of the debate? Well, if we think of the Paris Accords, the climate change accords, it very much takes a long-term perspective. The idea that history matters and that we need to understand how climate has changed over time is at the center of these policy frames. The other reason why history matters for policymakers is when you think about mobility or the urban space, urban planning, these are processes that take decades, that take centuries to change. And so, as urban planners know, and even policymakers that try to change urban systems, you really are there for the long haul. That's very different from politicians who are there usually only for a political cycle, but for policymakers and urban planners and engineers, the mobility system is there for the long haul. And then the third reason why history matters in these talks about climate change and how we can be less car dependent is that history can serve as a source of inspiration. The person who introduced the notion of the usable past was Dwight Brooks in 1918, coming out of a very painful phase in American history where the Civil War had been fought over slavery, and the American North had won over the American South, and there was a lot of rewriting of history to understand the present. And the story of slavery was also suppressed. And so White Brooks and others really introduced this notion that history cannot be only the story of winners. It also needs to have the story of the people who maybe did not win. In our book, we divided the book in three parts. One was how history was used by making a story, a narrative about how the car was inevitable. So that was selling the inevitable. And since then, Peter Norton, a very fine historian of automobility, has written a book that goes deeper into this notion. So General Motors, just to give you a brief update, General Motors introduced the notion in 1939 that the future was the car, and in order to do so, in all their public articulations, the walking and, for example, was seen as something that was the past, and public transit was also seen as something that is a part of the past. Now, understand for Hong Kong, this is still a very, very strange, because you are so much an urban space where density rules everything. So public transit is excellent. But in most of other places in the world, automobility did make an enormous impact, and General Motors was very much in the business of selling that through the uses of history. In the second part, we tell stories about how, if you look from a diversity point of view, and you look at the roads not taken, very interesting things develop. So, for example, we have a contribution of the Soviet Union, where public money was invented in public transit, and not automobility because of the communist system. And so we ask the question, or we offer that as a possibility, to look at that history as a way of leapfrogging towards the future, to get more sustainable mobility. And then the third part, I know that for historians this is maybe not shocking news, but in the context where I am operating, we always have to remind our audience is that history is always part of contestation, trade-offs, and more importantly, that there are pockets of persistence that might be useful for recovering stories that bring us to the future. So I want to tell one sort of story of modernism. What you see on the screen are two self-portraits. They come from Spain, part of the Dadaist movement. On the right, it's the same painter. So on the left is in 1898, and you see here two men and the author or the painter on the bicycle, going against the grain. They saw themselves as going against the stuffy Victorian times, and so this was, and they used the bicycle as their vehicle to express modernism. And it was hung in this very famous cafe, and then about 6 years later, he made another self-portrait, and then was in a car. Usually we tell this story about replacement, that the car replaced the bicycle. And this is a sort of a perfect, a picture-perfect example of the very short time in which the bicycle was first seen as the vehicle of modernism. And within 5 or 6 or 7 years, it was replaced by cars, and bicycles were no longer seen as modern, but actually as a vehicle of the working class, as old-fashioned. If you were behind the curve, then you rode the bicycle. And that is just a fascinating to see how something comes in fashion, then out of fashion, and we now know it becomes in fashion. And from a innovation story point of view, we still are looking at an innovation that, first of all, has not really changed since the 90s. Its durability is quite extraordinary. It still is a vehicle with two wheels, but we can see from our current stories that innovations are also about narratives and their meanings. It's not only about the material, but it's about the meaning, how they're understood as maybe forward-looking or backward-looking. So here we see the Dadaist in the 1890s. You see on the left the painting that I just showed, and on the right, a couple of years later, the other painting. So now, we all are familiar with the other narrative, the Corbusier, and we see here the General Motors. This was the future. We're looking at the exhibit, New York exhibit in 1939. And this was the selling of the future by also suppressing the past and actually what was going on. I'm showing here the image that was only 20 or 30 years before that. Bicycles were very much associated with women's liberation and modernity, and I also have some wonderful images of modern Chinese women around that time. So this is usually how we then are presenting the March of Progress of one of replacement, where we come from 1902 and we go to the future in a wonderful linear fashion. As historians, we know, and Peter Norton's work is absolutely crucial in this, that cars were actually seen as entering urban space as the vehicles of death in a very visual way. And these are images from the 1920s and 30s. The dance of death that goes on between sidewalks of New York. So here we see not a very positive image of cars as absolutely not as images of modernity, and on people's mind were the many accidents that happen. And this story is actually global. We see this almost everywhere. The more we learn through our Cycling Cities project, it's a very much a global story of industrialization. What is maybe surprising for us today is to realize in the US, the country that we associate with automobility, and as a place where that struggle went on just as pointedly as elsewhere. In the car industry, I'm showing you some images from Germany. This is then from the US, and we have it in the UK. And also in art history, cycling was first seen as part of modernism, one on the left. But here on the right, I'm also showing an image from a still from a movie of Bertolt Brecht and Kurt Weill, where you see the first shifting of meanings of cycling as part of the working class. And this is a film where the working class and cycling are part of that story. Now, usually we tell the story of cycling as one from a high share in urban mobility to a lower share. So we can present this as a story of decline. But we can also read it in many other ways. What you see, if I explain, this is the kind of work that we did. This is really hard work to get a graph like this. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours of labor, historical labor that goes into this. But what you see here is a time frame from 1920 below to 2015. And then what we call the share of cycling in traffic. This is based on traffic count. Well, we can say maybe it's one of decline, and that's usually how boosters of automobility tell the story of decline. But you can also say, well, it's still quite significant that 30% of the traffic is cycling, and you see also an uptick, and it's always one of a relationship. There's also another way to tell this story, not one of the decline. If we look at sheer production globally, and that should not surprise you in China at all, but it's always a surprise to people outside China and Hong Kong, is that there are actually more bicycles sold than cars. So I'm always showing this to remind people that this easy narrative of the inevitability of automobility is false. Um, I have been, I'm showing here also a quote of how important meaning is in the way we understand an innovation. So this is a quote from 1923 in Berlin, where the observer looks at the car and sees after World War I that suddenly the bicycles that were modern, then were dismissed as modern, are now having a role again on the street. Now, the same we see another observer in British Rhodesia in the 1930s, where he's just astounded to see how the bicycle has been used in very different ways than what he had first understood the bicycle to be. And that was sort of the story of the modernist in. Sorry, I have to. Gonna get some tea to. Okay. So this was the story where the modernists were and the colonial administrators were upset to see people in, for example, in Vietnam, we have stories of Indonesia, and here in Rhodesia, that the working class and women and local people are taking up what is considered to be a Western innovation. Let me see. Get my next slide. There was so much invested in that story of what is modern and what is truly innovative. Here I'm showing you Hitler during the war. He was visiting a bicycle factory, and within a year, that this picture was actually never published because they realized that to associate Hitler with a bicycle would put Germany in a kind of at the bottom of the race of modernism, if you will, with the United States. So this photo was suppressed for that reason. And even though most people in Germany were riding bicycles and not cars, is part of the push for the military, this image was suppressed. Okay, now I want to switch from the story of innovation of what is modern, what is forward-looking, to past dependency and inevitability. So how we got the urban space that we have today is quite astonishing, and it needs repeating. I'll go through this quickly. So this is New York, and you see everybody on the street, and to engineers and policymakers and police, this looked chaotic. So you see the story of how chaotic it is, and so there is a coordinated effort by the car industry to get separation of speed. Separation and disciplining traffic. This is a campaign in the US, but you find it in Germany, you find it in the Netherlands, you find it in Indonesia, and it's how to discipline people to not to jaywalk. That is to say, to learn how to cross a street that is really dominated by cars. So there's a century-long way of disciplining pedestrians. And the image that I'm showing here is what we have now all internalized. You do not diagonally cross a street as we were always used to do, because that's the most rational thing to do. And if you have 2 points, you cross diagonally and not the way we now cross with traffic lights and so forth. So this is another image, another campaign of teaching children how to cross the street. And the idea is that you are endangering yourself if you're not taking cars into account. And so it's a very different image as the image that I showed earlier. Since the 1920s, these are highways. The right is the famous Autobahn in Germany. And we now take this for granted that this is normal, but there was a lot of engineering and legal construction to make that possible, because it means a highway means that you have to exclude pedestrians, that you have to exclude wagons and horses, that you have to exclude cyclists, and that this space is only reserved for cars. If you think about it, it's quite extraordinary. And how extraordinary that is, a highway, I'll show you on the left, where we see the first highway in the Netherlands. And I'm sure that what you also find remarkable is how many cyclists there are there. Well, there's a whole story behind it, but I'll give the short version of it. Highways were built here and, as you can see, in Germany and elsewhere in the world when there were actually no cars. This was planning for the future. And in order to address the many cyclists in the Netherlands, there were bicycle paths built through a tax measure that it was at first meant only to build cars, but was then also used to make bicycle lanes. But bicycle lanes, I mean, it's very controversial in a way, were first built to get cyclists out of the way and to make way for cars. And let me see. Yeah, this is, I'll go through this quickly. These are figures to show that in the Netherlands, that the tax income through bicycle tax was actually used more for the cars that were not there. So you see on the left is the revenue that cyclists, 95% that cyclists brought in, and how much. How few cars there were, actually only 2%, and then you see how much contribution cyclists contributed to the car infrastructure compared to motorists. Well, these are fine points, but just to give you a sense. But this is not only a story of the Netherlands. Here we have in Sweden also a story where the engineers, the traffic engineers, were photographing the streets. And you see on the left, we have hundreds and hundreds of photographs, and Martin Emanuel, the author of a fine article, showed that this car that you see appeared in every image that the department was taking. It was creating the idea that there was a need to separate space that had always been shared for cars. And you see on the right in Swedish, the separation of cyclists and pedestrians that now have to share a fewer space. And then on the right, we see an image of one of the first clover constructions to facilitate cars, and what you see, of course, are pedestrians and buses and cyclists. But this is all in anticipation of automobility. Here we have another image for the Netherlands, same story, and we can go on and on and on. What is interesting about the bicycle lane, I wrote an article about it with my colleague Adrien Labouez, is that in the 1970s, the bicycle lane became a symbol of intervention and liberation for cyclists. But historically, as I showed with the other picture, it was actually one of pushing away cyclists out of way for cars. So it tells you how something that is materially the same can have a different meaning. Okay, so the sense of inevitability, I already showed this image, but I want to give you a sense of how that works in terms of data collection. So here we discovered, this is also a fascinating image. You see here on the left, you see students counting traffic in a city in the Netherlands. And the reason they were counting it was because a German engineer was asked by the city to come up with a plan, a circulation plan for the city. And he said, being German and being thorough, he said, yes, I need some data, what the traffic is like in the city in order to sketch the future. And in the course of the data collection, they discovered there were actually a lot of cyclists in the street. And what happened next was that in his report, he said, yes, these cyclists are there, but they will not there be in the future. So here we have a plan for cars. And this, I mean, this is an instance where we can really see the creation of inevitability, the narrative of March of Progress and Modernity, but it in a very clear and visually attractive fashion, but it happens everywhere. And in another way, I want to emphasize this is that on the right, we have the research that was done to understand motorists. And this was at the same time. And what you see is that pedestrians and cyclists were clearly seen as numbers, and the motorists were interviewed individually. They were always seen as individuals with their own needs, and much more resources were put into them and their needs than the mass of pedestrians and cyclists. Now, the 1970s have been famous for a social protest. And what is fascinating to me as a historian of technology, and again, technology, I should have started this lecture with this, but technology to us, to me, to our journal, is really material culture. It is, if you want to give a definition of technology, it's not only the artifacts, but it's the people who use the artifacts and the knowledge that they need to use that artifact. So it's the material culture and the knowledge and the people that are part of that. And you can see here examples of what in the 70s became a movement of repurposing older technologies for new purposes. So we see here on the left waste, the throwaway, the waste society being a point of protest for the environment, and the bicycle was also part of that. So the bicycle had become, was a symbol of modernism in the 1890s, then became a symbol of being old-fashioned and working class, and now in the 70s it was repurposed as a symbol of for the environment and for anything that's vulnerable and that needed to be protected, and that's what you see on the right. So what I told you that I have become almost obsessed with the story of cycling. So this is a story about innovation, and but it's also that's how I start to think about this as a prism through which to understand change. So I in transition studies in innovation, it's always about modern, the new is better. And what the cycling story shows is that innovation is not one of replacement and preparation. It's not that you had two wheels and then you had four wheels. You had cycling and then you had cars as a better innovation. What all these stories show is that cycling always remained a serious alternative, was always a competitor to automobility, and so we see that what the old and the new, as I wrote somewhere, is rode in tandem, and that they uh, that it survives in the dominant car regime, and in terms of how innovation is always a social technical system. You always have to understand the material as part of giving meaning. The reframing of innovations from modern to unmodern to being sustainable is really what the lessons learned. And in terms of how innovation studies are thinking about this in the history of technology is how technologies can endure, and that the stories that we tell about history of technology as one of innovation, of the point of innovation, that is what history of technology is. That's basically the most exciting scholarship is about how technology endure, how people, basically part of the social practice theory. And within that those studies, the social practice theory, the Elizabeth Shove that I'm highlighting here, she's a sociologist and thinking about sustainable mobility transition, and she also has used our historical work on cycling to say that the pockets of persistence that cycling represent also give us hope towards the future. Cycling, it has also been oppositional, has been used oppositionally, and it shows also the roads not taken. So for me, the case of cycling tells you so much more about how innovations work in general. And it reminds us, this might not interest, this might not interest you so much, but it is important in innovation studies, is that most of the innovation studies are focused on the future, and they miss what is disappearing and still might be important. And finally, to my mind, that ultimately the present and the past and future are all one. You cannot design a mobility system without taking it into account the past and the present. So that is why I have coined this idea of U-turns to the future, to get us out of this progress talk and to think about what change means. So I go quickly through theories of change. Since you're all historians, or many in the audience, I assume are familiar with this, I'll go through this quickly. Historicism is, of course, started with Montaigne and Pico. And to me, why they're important is that they understand time as they understand change. And Pico in particular, I'm fascinated with him because he was trying to understand how the cycles of history, there were cycles, but they came back to the same point, but at a different point. So that some things remain the same, but others change. And this kind of the different temporalities is what is important to me. I think we're still very much in this Hegelian notion of progress, and there are, of course, different ways of thinking about it. Ogden and Boas have been very important in cultural anthropology to show that innovations can, Ogden was part of the Hegelian idea that innovation had a sort of origin, and there was only one innovator, and Boas introduced the notion that there were different that in time that people in different places could actually invent the same thing, so that is important to introduce here. So transition studies have been also thinking about temporalities, and we have now the Anthropocene as another way of thinking about change. Management studies is also always about, change management studies as a whole, also a big field to think about how we can have a more sustainable society. And finally, there's a whole branch of studies of scholarship that think about path dependency. That is to say that something in the past that was introduced very early has enormous impact for what happens later on, and that you cannot get away from that path dependency. So what we have been doing in Eindhoven is to introduce the notion of historical transition studies, to really, as historians, to help the current debate to be much more sophisticated about how we can move towards a more sustainable future. So here are some of the terminologies that are important for innovation studies. We critique the idea that what matters is only the present and the future, that innovation is about replacement, that it's always about progress, newness, that things are inevitable, path dependence. I think all these terms I have commented on. And so what historical transition studies then are interested in is, first of all, the long term, things of simultaneity and different temporalities, U-turns, the paths not taken, the contestation, repurposing, and pockets of persistence. And the last I want to introduce here is circularity, this notion that things from the past can come back. And what we need are U-turns if we want to think about theories of change. We need to go to, in order to move to the future, we need to go to the past. And here I'm introducing as my last image, this strange highway that we think is inevitable, and that we think of making sense for the way we understand mobility. Why I find this a fascinating image, I mean, it's just a artist impression, but it is about how appropriating current infrastructure for different purposes, you can get a very different future. And the irony, of course, ultimately is that the notions about shared space are very, 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 very old. This image also, for me, sort of represents this alternative reading about how durable infrastructures are. We think of infrastructures as being very hard, but you can see how soft these infrastructures really are if you introduce an intervention like this and repurpose it and appropriate it. And therefore, the future is sometimes behind us, or we have to reinvent it. And I like to end my talk here to help us think through how we move to the future by looking back. Thank you very much. And I'm very much interested to hear your questions. Let's see. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ruth. For those of you in the audience, please post your questions in the Q&A box so that Ruth can see them for you. While we're waiting for our audience to type in their questions, if I may take this opportunity. This is really fascinating talk, and although I've read your articles and I've heard you talk in person, there's been a lot of keywords I feel like that are really important in understanding this new historical transition studies that you and your colleagues are promoting. And I was wondering if you could go back to the last slide before the image where you had a series of ideas here that you were concluding to think about this new U-turn theories of change. And I was wondering, one of the things that I noted in this keywords, and I think it's not just semantics, because I think the words are important in thinking about reframing the knowledge and how we understand these themes. I was wondering what about the role of the military or military industrial complex in understanding these new U-turns theories of change. If we look at infrastructure, if we look at innovation, we look at technological histories. Unfortunately, the role of war, as we were talking earlier, has played a huge role. And I wonder, how do you see this playing in this U-turn to the future, present, and the past?
Yeah, I mean, no doubt. Huh? I would. You can call it the military-industrial complex or the military-industrial academic complex. The powers that be are very, very oppressive, and they're very hard, right? But what we also have learned from the 1970s and from social movements in general is sometimes the giant is not so giant, right? And that's why I actually like that last picture. I mean, it's the simplest intervention one can think of, and how powerful that is, and as a humanities and a historian of he's trained at Yale, where discourse analysis was so important. And I've always struggled with precisely this question, like, how important is discourse when the powers that be are so strong, or when the infrastructure is so strong? And I would say in the last 20 years of my work, I've really come to understand how and that's why the bicycle is so important to me, how important meaning is, right?
Yeah.
How we call it in history of technology, social technical system, right? The notion that you cannot have a technology without having it embedded socially, because you can invent whatever, but if people cannot use it, or the legal regime is not ready. But I would really also introduce under the social is also the cultural and the meaning. And I know cultural studies people find that, like, of course, cultural anthropologies will say, of course. What I'm interested in here is exactly your question, is how it intersects with the sort of the hardware, or the hard politics, and that's sort of what I'm trying to do in my work, and that's why the bicycle is so important to me, right? And also, maybe I can say something about the COVID time, right? During COVID, I don't know if it's true in Hong Kong, but definitely in the Netherlands, people started to walk and to cycle. Now, walking in the Netherlands is actually quite extraordinary, because people only cycle, right? So they discovered walking, and used exactly the same kind of infrastructure. And then the question that we all ask is, okay, is COVID the tipping point, right? And to think differently about our urban spaces. I have to say, the example of France and the example of the Netherlands is very instructive. So the Netherlands is a cycling country. We have a lot of infrastructure for cycling, but also very much automobility. COVID actually does not have an impact on policy. But in France, where we have a socialist mayor who was very much interested in cycling and thinking about Paris differently, she used COVID to make very radical changes. And there are other places in the world. So what you learn there is things can have another meaning, and there can be kind of a rupture through, in this case, the pandemic, but a crisis is a rupture, but it's always how that rupture is being used, and the stakeholders. And I'm saying something that historians are very familiar with. It's complex. There's complexity, and there's all these different things. But in my engineering context, always have to explain that it's never a causal relationship.
Can I follow up on that? It's fascinating, and I'm thinking, you just then when you're answering Izumi's questions, you mentioned social technical systems and all that, and then you also mentioned transition, path dependency. But today, other than the last example you have used in France, comparing France and the Netherlands, in your studies, you have studied cycling in cities for more than 10 years now. Do you see any? Can you kind of categorize how, are there different culture? How different cultures imagine the future with bicycle? Because now we imagine the use of bicycle with what we see now, roads and highways and whatever. And in Europe you have a system. In China we have a different system. So different people imagine the future with the bicycle in different ways. So I wonder if you have come up with some preliminary theories on how infrastructure affect the use of bicycle as something that you imagine the future, or I don't know whether you understand what I'm trying to say.
Well, what we did, we now have about 20 studies in 10 different countries on cycling. And so we devised 5 factors that play into this. So one is, what is the urban place infrastructure? Is it a compact city or is it a suburbanized city? So that's factor 1. Factor 2 is, what are the mobility alternatives? So is public transit very is there a good alternative or not to cycling, or is cycling an alternative to services that are not provided? So we call that mobility alternatives. Then the third is, how do engineers imagine, or what's their practice in understanding traffic? Are they looking at the street and see, a shared space as chaos, and do they have the philosophy that you need traffic separation, or are they thinking about traffic calming as a model and shared space? Then the fourth is, what's the role of the social movement? Are cyclists or pedestrians organized in some fashion, and what's the status of that? And then finally is the cultural representation. Is the bicycle seen as a hopelessly old-fashioned vehicle for only the losers in a society, or is it actually seen as a lifestyle choice? And so in that sense, I don't know if I'm answering exactly your question, but we have been pretty sophisticated in understanding how some things are the same everywhere, but really accounting for local differences. And I'm very, very excited that so our first studies were all European, from different countries, and what we learn is there are no countries. That is to say, within a country you have differences. So in the Netherlands there are 5 different ways that the policy outcomes, and even in France you have Grenoble is a cycling city, but Lyon is not. I can tell you for every country, you have these differences. So that's something that we, in terms of urban studies, right, we've learned really that a local context really, really matters. And through these 5 factors, we are able to tell a much more sophisticated story. And we have our first African story, Johannesburg, also fascinating because Johannesburg was part of the colonial industrial complex, the workers who went to the diamond mines. And I'm just absolutely would be wonderful to have Chinese examples, but we are also starting a project in Africa. So we have like 10 or 12 places in Africa as well, and we will have a book. So if we can collaborate on that, that would be sort of my dream. If we can have the Chinese and the Hong Kong examples
Especially
as well,
China.
because
I think China would be a wonderful case.
yeah,
I mean,
maybe
cases
more
of
than Hong
study.
Kong. Yeah. But have I answered your question though?
Yes, that's exactly what I want to know. Because
Okay.
because you have you have presented something on a more theoretical theoretical side, and I was thinking, I mean, how do you see all these theories coming together in a real human
Well,
setting?
actually, my theories come out of the case studies and my thinking about how it works. So I did not start from the theories. I started from what I've learned. Oh, yeah. Maybe a little bit eclectic, but yeah.
Thank you so much. I think we have 2 questions in the Q&A box. One is from Professor Mei Jianjun from the Needham Institute, who's also on our advisory board for the Making Modernity in East Asia project. And he asks, can you further explain how to reframe the past for the case of mobility?
Let's see, since this is globally transmitted talk, I wonder what all of us can learn from the global south. Well,
that's your colleague, Mikael, I think.
Yes,
yes.
Yes.
So please take whichever one you like first.
Okay, so no, absolutely. I mean, it's basically, I think we can learn everything from the global south, because it's in the global south has been positioned as in the modernist narrative as not being modern, and that's precisely what I'm proposing here, is by understanding. I mean, I could maybe say, U-turns to the global south. I think that would work very well as well. That the future is maybe in the global south and not in the global north. But since I'm not a global south historian, I have not gone there, but I can see enormous potential, and that is also why I'm very much interested in collaborating with scholars in the global south. But as Michael Hart knows, I'm very excited to work with a whole group of African scholars, and I'm hope that we will learn from that experience. And as I said, we have this one study of Johannesburg, and I think I've really appreciated both how important transnational history is. There are some things that have operated globally through the transnational. At the same time, our studies show how important the urban comparative level is, and that the nation state in this story is much less important than the transnational and the local. Interestingly enough, one one research that we were thinking about was also to compare cities where the car industry is very important, or nations where the car industry is important, and where the bicycle industry is very important, and to see how that impacts these local, national contexts. Yeah. I hope, let me see, because I think Michael Hart is saying something else. Let me see if I read this. So, a study in progress by Johannes van der Straten on electrically powered rickshaws in today's Bangladesh showed that the most exciting transition come from outside the West and have a hybrid character. I guess what I'm saying is that such case studies might help us avoid only looking back and avoid nostalgically. Yeah, I mean, in the sense that I don't want to say that we only look back, because I think that the theory of Elizabeth Shove, she talks about pockets of persistence, and I understand rickshaws are also, it is persistent. It is the social practice of people of something that works, and so it's not something from the past. It is really persistent. If that helps. Okay, then we have the next question. Can you further explain how to reframe the past for the case of mobility? Yeah, here I sort of hesitate. You know, if I were a policy maker or a consultant to a policy maker, I would probably consult that you would need to reframe cycling or walking as a lifestyle, as hip and happening, as something that if you are modern, quote unquote, then you cycle in. Yeah, so that's what I would say from a purely Machiavellian point of view. Now, as a historian, and that's very problematic, of course, because then you do not get out of the narrative of modernism or what is new. But yeah, and as I say, so that's one, and two, I'm really, as I said, fascinated by the pockets of persistence. One of the things we tried and we were thinking about is to think, for example, about parks as a pocket. Parks are places where people walk, have continued to walk, right? I mean, parks are 100, 200, 300 years old. And within urban context, that's where people from, in terms of their leisure time, have continued to have some practices, but they have other meanings. And we were thinking about parks, to see them as a place where you could think and reimagine what sustainability is, and to think about that as an area for change. Yeah, and then lastly, I think I now introduce. I actually did this this past week, where I was talking to policymakers, and I showed a historical image of the place where I live, where we're trying to get the future, and I showed something of the past and say, the past is the future, because that's where shared space was a practice that was always there, and to help policymakers understand that the era of automobility is actually exceptional. If you take 2,000 years of urban mobility, then automobility is just a very short period of time, and very problematic. It never worked. Cars in a city never worked. You had to really remake the city to adjust for cars. And this is not an insight that Jane Jacobs famously said that in the 1970s, and we're still trying to implement her work. But that would be another way of making an intervention by taking a larger time frame to understand it. I hope that I have answered your question. If not, please wave if you can, because I cannot see you. Are there maybe other questions? Oh, let's see.
Can I jump in while you are
Yes.
waiting for questions? I know that this study is not just as an academic study. You talk to a lot of policymakers, governments, and all that. Could you give us a couple of examples that tell how this study helped the policymakers to change or to design new ways of mobility in the city?
Yeah, it's actually fascinating. I guess as historians we feel pretty helpless, and but as I said, the policymakers have to deal with politicians who only think in 4 years. And so policymakers are very much looking for a long-term perspective. And we have had many different ways in which our studies are being used. I'll give you a couple of examples. So in one case in The Hague, the policymaker, they didn't need any insights from us because they basically knew it, but they needed the study for the politicians to imagine the future. So it was very much, and they also needed the policymaker as to brand the city as forward-looking. So they used it in two ways: internally for their politicians and externally for city branding. In the case of another city, they used it. They asked us to write a history of cycling. This was a place where cycling had been powerful and important, and it had disappeared. And they asked us to really to give workshops to the policymakers who were in the process of writing their policy. So that was another use. Then in the Johannes case, policymakers and politicians were not involved in it because the politics had changed. But the funding was through social networks, was very much from the activists. And there it helped them to reunite or reignite the relationships with the policymakers. Let me see another example. In the case of Munich, the policymaker who provided some funding, but very little actually, there it was part of his legacy of the kind of policymaking he had made. So every time we see very different dynamics, and as an historian, I'm not in the business of raising money. I mean, that's not what I like to do at all. It's a nuisance, but actually here it's very functional because you learn what the local context is, what the stakeholders are. And because we have a very rigorous way of, an academic way of analyzing it, it also provides us insight across the globe of how it works. So it's very exciting, actually. And I think there's then also the way history can be inspiring, just as a story. You don't realize that there are a lot of people who write policy papers all the time. They just love to read a story about their city and be inspired. So it's not a one-on-one that it has direct impact, but it does on a sort of broader scale. And because we work locally, and then also say, you know, do you want a workshop? Do you want the booklet? And we make it very attractive to read with a lot of images so that we engage. So we put a lot of effort into writing in accessible prose, free of any jargon, free of any theory, but we know the theory and the jargon behind it and the keywords. You know, that's what we know. But that's in that sense, it's public history.
Thank you.
I think there's another question, right? Yeah. Well, thank you. How can we understand both urban histories and history of mobility from the perspectives of both over and underground natural environments? How do factors like climate, weather, terrain affect policies regarding mobility in urban planning? Wow, what a fascinating question. I must admit, I don't know. Yeah, maybe I should say something about the limits. Let me. I no longer see any of you. Let me see. Yeah. Okay. That's a great question. I started this research in 2009, and it was just, you know, a coincidence. And and I got more and more fascinated by it. And the critique that some people have, rightfully so, is that you could do the same very fascinating and probably even more fascinating studies if you were to look at it from the pedestrian point of view. I mean, there is one of the most exciting new research is from the point of view of the pedestrians, the pedestrian story. So I very much encourage anyone in this audience to take that up. The story of climate and underground, I really do not have any knowledge about that. There are people who have talked about cities from the point of the underground. It is fascinating. So yeah, I'm afraid that I have to maybe ask other people in the audience to answer this question, because I really do not know the answer to that. But yeah, maybe only to say is that in the same way that the bicycle, if you look through the lens of the bicycle, you get very different stories of the city. In the same way that if you look through the lens of the underground, you get very different stories. You get very different stories if you say residents of a city are not just the people who live in it, but also the animals and the insects. Then you get many more. The numbers are much higher. If you just do that you get very fascinating new narratives. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's actually a fair amount of interesting studies on cemeteries that have become liminal spaces that are both public parks, but also not just hosting humans, but different kinds of species, whether it's animals or insects and fauna and flora. And I think there's been a fair amount of public cemeteries in London that's been the source of study, as well as in Denmark, to think about not just the human actor, but the non-human actors, both pedestrian and otherwise. If I could follow up with a question, but actually there's more questions in the Q&A box, so maybe you'd like to address those first.
Yeah, let me see. So we have the mobility justice. Can we use your idea of U-turn to the future to achieve some of her ideas about social justice? Yeah, I think Absolutely. I mean, we know her to be a sociologist of mobility, but she's actually trained as a historian. I think the bicycle story is very much part of how some groups of people have been pushed aside, that it goes at the heart of what her work is about. So by all means, we need to look at that. For example, while in a lot of the narratives, and I'm also participating in that, right? Is to say that cycling is more sustainable than cars. True. In other contexts, where people depend on cars to commute to their work and there are no other services, then cars can be a vehicle of, well, I won't say social inclusion. There's an inequity, but we need to understand this in relationship to each other. So I would say understanding automobility is always contextual, is also always contingent, and her work is extremely important. I love her work as an inspiration, and I have several PhDs who are working on this very topic and to understand this in a long-term perspective. Yes, absolutely. Then let's see. Jonas, okay. What do you think about the concept of micromobility, which has become one of the recent trends in mobility studies? My feeling is that it's very Western-centric because it's inextricably linked with the historical narrative that micromobility has emerged in recent years as a reaction to the dominating paradigm of automobility, in line with your U-turn argument. But what about world regions where automobility never became the dominant paradigm, especially in the global South? Aren't we projecting concepts and assumptions about micromobility to these places which don't understand empirical scrutiny? Yes, I could not agree more. There's a real danger of getting locked into the modernist. Let me see. I have to switch back and forth between the Q&A and to have a sense of audience. It's true. And as you know very well, in the context of Eindhoven, where we are in an engineering institution, it works very well to talk about micromobility rather than talk about cycling and so forth. And the way I think about these concepts is they are always functioning in a context in which you talk about this. So yes, I talk about micromobility in the Eindhoven context. There it makes sense. But if we talk to a global audience, it does not make sense. And I'm fine with using these, I won't say opportunistically, but to understand that some words and contexts and discourses have to be used in some ways as an intervention. The micromobility term is right now not very sophisticated. It is indeed a way to understand all these social practices of two wheels, like the steps and the e-bikes and the the different things that are emerging right now. And for now it works, but in the long term, I don't think it does work. So you're absolutely right. Yeah. Let's see. Other than policymaking and urban planning, do you think this concept of repurposing have any impacts on modern businesses as well? In a larger sense, yes. I have talked only about it in this narrow sense of urban planners and engineers, repurposing is actually the business, if I may use your language, is the business of users. Users, when they use a new innovation, are always repurposing, if it works for them, to appropriate it to their particular context. And what we know from the stories of use, that there's always a great degree of repurposing. And businesses that are trying to sell us stuff, in order to be successful, need to understand that users need to be able to use it. So the story of repurposing goes much further. I mean, I've talked about it here in a political sense as part of social movement, but there are marketeers who are thinking about this in terms of what makes sense in a business sense. Right, that if you want to innovate and then you need to think about repurposing. That's one. That's in a traditional business sense. But in terms of sustainability, there is now the circular economy. People are thinking about how the cycle of an artifact, how it can be repurposed and used in a way that it remains sustainable. So their repurposing is also very important. I talked about it in a kind of limited sense, if you will. Yeah. Are there any other questions? Oh yeah, there's even, okay, let me see. If I can see it. Can maybe someone...
Yeah. Would you like me to read it?
Yeah, read it, because it falls off my screen.
Okay. It's by David Drake. The history of bicycle use in the global south brings the danger of narratives with it that depict this use only as a result of situations of scarcity rather than of ingenuity and innovation. How do we avoid falling into that Eurocentric trap? After all, bicycles in both rural and urban Malawian contexts, for example, were and still are used because it simply makes a lot of sense, often more than using cars and trucks. And this is
Yeah.
David,
Yeah, I mean,
Global Hub Project.
I mean, absolutely. And let me see how I could have given that that impression. The danger of depicting it only as the result of scarcity. No, I mean, if I was implying that that's just a history of representation, if you will. So the way the modernist narrative has been, that the working class is using it as part of because they don't have cars, or in terms of war, if there are no other sources. I mean, I think that our stories all over the world show exactly what you're describing here, and that is what we are hoping to get off the ground with the new African cycling cities story. It is a story of rationality and maybe to emphasize it another way. So what we find in a lot of these stories from different places is that social democrats in the 1920s and 30s were investing a lot of money in public transit systems. And to their despair, they found that workers were not taking the tram, but were using this new innovation of the bicycle as an alternative. And it makes total sense for workers to take a bicycle because it was more flexible, it's cheaper, it was door to door. And so here you see really a clash of what well-intended policymakers try to do for the working class, and it didn't make sense. So I think that is very much part of the European story as well. That there is a great sense of rationality if we talk, of course, about utility cycling, because there are three types of cycling. There's racing, there's the leisurely use of cycling and touring, and then there's utility cycling. And it's helpful to make those distinctions. And of course, some people use it, the bicycle, to do touring and utility, so you cannot always make that distinction. So I think, David, that actually, I would say that the history of bicycle use does not bring us in the wrong fashion. I think that it's precisely this kind of rich stories that we see in Europe as well. And I'm very much looking, of course, to your work and others in the audience to help us with understanding and getting a truly global point of view on cycling. Then Alexandra Osorio, let's see. Knowing that you have expanded research on the relationship between gender and technology extensively, I wonder if gender should also play a role in U-turn theories of change, especially if we acknowledge that technology users have different experience based on their genders, which, for example, have played a huge role in women's experiences in urban transport. Yes, absolutely. One of the things I do regret is that in the current histories, we do not have a very sophisticated stories about what it means from a gender point of view in the current project. I will say that Tina Minister Funk in the book has a wonderful contribution about how automobility in the context of the studies where she looked had a devastating impact on women's ability to move around the city as walkers and cyclists, and that a lot of the traffic counting only looks at commuters and really misses women as using cycling and cars, for that matter, for multiple tasks, right? So there's an incredible bias in mobility studies of, and we also relied on the studies on the graphs that I showed, right? The graphs is, you could say, is a male graph in a sense based on commuting data, where they look at the movements of people between 6 o'clock in the morning and 9 o'clock, and then again from 5 till 7 to capture workers going to work, and it doesn't capture women's movement. So absolutely, yeah. Is the how gendered is technology of mobility, especially in the colonial or Asian cultural context, or both? I'm not sure if it's more gendered in the colonial Asian cultural context. I would say it's probably as gendered as I just actually from the examples that I know. In the European context, we also have this terrible bias of mobility. So I don't know enough about the colonial and the Asian context. I'm actually, to be quite honest with you, I think that there is more similarity between Europe and Asia and the global South than you would think. These biases, if you look at it in class and gender and ethnicity, work exactly the same way as in Europe. And in some ways, I would say that, Hong Kong and Paris look more alike because of the important place of public transit and walking. In the way I understand Hong Kong, maybe I'm misdirected here, but I think that it might not always be useful to think in terms of Asia versus Europe or the global South and global North. I think it's more useful to think about the similarities between Shanghai and as a portal system. I mean, to think about portal systems, or that has really helped me to think about wherever the British Empire went and industrialization went, you see similarities, and that's more useful to me. And then you will see these gender dynamics. No.
Thank you so much, Ruth, for your wonderful talk and answering all these questions. I think we learned a lot about your project, and we are all fascinated by your project. And I really hope that you can come to Hong Kong, visit China one of these days, so that
I really hope so too. And
so that we can find out more about cycling.
Yeah.
Right.
And I really would like to collaborate with you on more than one sense, because we only talked about bicycles, but I am also the editor-in-chief of Technology and Culture, and I want to extend the invitation to all of you to come up with your manuscripts, but also books that we might have missed. We are very interested in having a global coverage, not just in English, but also if there are books that in Chinese that need to be reviewed, then we also want to know about it. So the door is open. I want to make sure that you understand that we're very much looking forward to collaborate with you in more than one sense, not just bicycles.
We will try our best. Our team will try our best, because we have collaborators all over East Asia, and hopefully we can contribute something in the near future. And we look forward. I really look forward to more output coming out from your current project, which really is fascinating. Thank you so much, and thank you everybody for attending this talk. And we will have another talk later in April. It's about China. And I hope that some of you are interested and can join us in late April. So please join me in thanking Ruth for this wonderful talk.
Thank you.
Thank you. Until next time, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.